Criminologists don't always agree what organized crime is. Neither does the press nor the citizenry. We have various organized crime legislation, and they want to broaden it and take jurisdiction. It becomes a jurisdictional battle to where any organized group, whether syndicated or not, becomes organized crime as far as the press is concerned and the politicians are concerned. One reason, I think the main reason, is it's fueled by funding. And I want to talk about a case I've talked about in the past, and I don't like harping on it, but I have to. It's the Tannenbaum-Rhea affair. If you recall, both were clients of mine. One worked for a group around the NSA, the other one worked for a group collected around the FBI. And all these intelligence agencies got involved in a pissing contest where J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Helms quit talking to each other. It led to congressional investigations and things like that. I've got the transcripts if anyone wants to know, read them. It was on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. In any event, professor disappears. He was Kissinger's graduate student, Brzezinski's first cousin, and the CIA, in their disclosures, claimed they'd never heard of him, which in my estimation, then the CIA confesses to the most gross incompetence I'd ever seen. Be that as it may, Mrs. Tannenbaum was married to a couple cryptographers. She worked for Boland Air Force Base people herself, which later became Anacostia Naval Base, which is a data collection, spy, intelligence billet for the Navy. And she has every earmark of being an agent provocateur infiltrating various groups, which I think she was doing in Boulder. Anyway, Rhea disappears. Tannenbaum gets prosecuted for essentially cashing a check written on Rhea's account that she has authority to do, but it was an excuse to prosecute her. And I'm skipping a lot of little details. I suppose if people want to know, they can look at some of my prior postings. In any event, she gets charged in Boulder with some sort of theft of Rhea's property because he disappeared. Nobody knew that he had disappeared or not, or where he went, or if foul play was involved. But Tannenbaum claimed that Rhea gave her authority to write the check. The prosecutor claimed she didn't. There weren't any witnesses one way or the other. But she went to trial, and her lawyer pleaded her not guilty by reason of insanity, which was curious. At which point she is supposedly going to go to the state hospital for treatment and maybe release at some point in her career or life. Meanwhile, this prosecution was in Boulder. The prosecutor in Denver, who had grand political illusions, decided to file a case there, called a grand jury to investigate, and all of a sudden strange things happened there. What happened is he was visited by two CIA agents out of the Denver headquarters of the CIA, run by a guy named Ted Dodorovich, which wasn't supposed to be there anyway because domestic intelligence was the jurisdiction of the FBI and not the CIA. The two agents that worked for the CIA went to the prosecutor, Mike McKevitt, accompanied by an FBI agent. Now, I had heard from various ones of my informers that the CIA was infiltrating various agencies, particularly the DEA, or at that time the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD. And J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, wanted to know what the hell was going on. So he contacted Richard Helms and said, give me the name of my agent that accompanied your people to Mike McKevitt's office. And Richard Helms of the CIA essentially said no, or categorically said no, as a matter of policy. So they started arguing back and forth. The end result was the FBI and CIA broke off all liaison. In the meantime, the administration was trying to merge all of the intelligence agencies under one roof, called the Houston Plan. Of course, this pissing match caused the Houston Plan to fail. Well, in the meantime, people forgot about why they were visiting Mike McKevitt at all. The end result is McKevitt dropped his case against Tannenbaum. She was sent off to the state hospital where they murdered her. And McKevitt ran for office. He ran for Congress and miraculously got elected to a strongly Democratic post held by Byron Rogers and others over the years. He was a one-term Republican congressman, but a lot happened during his term. The Nixon administration was just gearing up for a lot of publicity on activities based on his crime schedule. Nixon ran on a law and order platform, and he was putting together a law and order agenda. And one of the leading components of that was fighting organized crime. He got very zealous, and one mafioso guy started up a group called the Italian American Civil Rights League, based on the premise that the Italian Americans were taking an unfair brunt of the anti-mafia legislation and organized crime activity of the government, which was probably fairly true. At least it was true, actually. So McKevitt goes to Washington, and at that time, the experts, the criminologists, asserted there wasn't much of an organized crime problem in Denver. The organized crime problem that did exist was within the Denver Police Department, and they didn't want to go into that. However, they needed funding to fight crime, and they didn't think they were getting their share. So McKevitt went to Washington and got a small grant and put together what he called the Denver Organized Crime Manual. It consisted of arrest records and mugshots, things like that, of most of the people in Denver whose names ended in a vowel. Some of whom were teachers, some of whom were civil servants, etc. But they had this big mafia crime book. And McKevitt used this book to get a large grant to fight organized crime in Denver. So about 1970, 71, thereabouts, I was defending a local chapter of the Italian American Civil Rights League, and the president of that league got accused and arrested for purloining public documents, namely the Organized Crime Manual. The reason I was representing these people is, first off, I had a record of civil rights work, and secondly, I got referrals from various relatives in Palm Springs and Chicago. Thirdly, I was planning on only practicing law for a few years and then going back in the academic world, and was going to finish up a doctorate in criminology at University of Wisconsin. But the war came along, funds dried up, so I decided to go play around for a year or two until the Vietnam War ended. Then I could go back to school. Well, that never happened. As you know, the Vietnam War went on and on and on, and funding never came back. When I started my academic career, the government, under the National Defense Education Act, paid for about everything. Now students have to borrow money and become indentured servants to the system. It's much different. The irony was the National Defense Education Act came under the Eisenhower administration was funded by Republican Congress, and now it's more of a 180-degree switch with Republicans and education funds. But that's an aside. Now, the statute read that any public employee that takes records that are to be filed or belong to any administrative agency purloins public records. That was how they charged Mr. Paulino. So the case goes along a while, and finally it comes to preliminary hearing. And I had a copy of the crime manual that was unnumbered, and the government or the state was trying to prosecute Paulino to find out what number was on his copy so they could prosecute the policeman that leaked the copy to the Italian American Civil Rights League. And they were pressuring their president to rat out the cop that presented them with the manual, which was pretty slanderous. The manual itself was a masterful PR piece, but lacked a lot of facts, etc. The prosecutor's witness was a detective named Molnix, who was their organized crime expert. And Molnix gets on the stand and said that the group had snatched a classified document, and that it showed up and it exposed all their methods and data about organized crime in Denver. Well, my copy didn't show any such things. It showed that they randomly, or not randomly, they methodically went through all of their files and called out most Italian Americans and put them in this book and implied that they were mafia connected. So they pretty much slandered a whole ethnic group. It was probably the forerunner of the U.S. Attorney in New York, Giuliani, going after his own people under mafia prosecution, becoming famous for being the anti-mob prosecutor. It's essentially a cultural conflict, which I'll explain probably in a later thing. But Molnix is on the stand, and they tried to establish the fact that the book was classified and it had secret information disclosing methodology against organized crime and all kinds of bullshit things like that. Then it becomes my turn to cross-examine. So in cross-examination, Molnix admit that the state has no authority to classify anything, and there was no reason it should be secret. That was just their own internal methodology of keeping track of where the manuals were and who had access to them and everything like that, because they didn't want it out generally to the press, because they knew the press would have a field day with their methodology and their tactics, etc. It was obviously a publicity ploy and a scam to get federal money for the city and county of Denver. Also, he showed a lacking knowledge of any kind of organized crime other than what he'd read in the police propaganda and press releases and things like this that the government was teaching prosecutors how to do. The government had all kinds of propaganda films out. They had TV programs like the Treasury Department film, the FBI series, and drug enforcement series, all kinds of things to aggrandize federal law enforcement with action movies, action series, action TV plays, etc. So Moldick is on the stand and I'm cross-examining him. And he's got his copy of the Organized Crime Manual and I got a copy. And I said, well, I'm going to see if these are the same. So I'm going to read a paragraph from the copy I have, and you can read the next paragraph, and we'll go back and forth to see if we have the same copies. That's what I told him. So I read a paragraph, and he reads a paragraph. I read a paragraph, he reads a paragraph. This goes on for a few minutes, and the judge says, well, Mr. Blewett, what's your point? And the point was, I held up a book. It was called Criminology by two professors named Sutherland and Cressy. And I wasn't reading from the copy of the Organized Crime Manual that I had in my possession. I was reading from Sutherland and Cressy's textbook on crime. And everything that Mr. Molnick's read from his copy was identical to what was in the Sutherland and Cressy book. So I said, well, Your Honor, I'm not reading from the manual, I'm reading for Sutherland and Cressy, and as far as I'm concerned, the only crime being committed here is plagiarism by the DA's office and Colorado Bureau of Investigation alleging organized crime and organized crime activity, and it's not their material, but it's that of Sutherland and Cressy. So I moved to dismiss. Well, the prosecutor was too stupid to understand the implication. Molnick's was too stupid to understand what was happening. All they did was get mad at the judge for dismissing it because they weren't supporting the crusade against organized crime, mainly because it didn't exist. So this is the politics behind a lot of this stuff. Now, the impact of this is really hard to relate and contemplate. But what it did at first is exposed me to the element of propaganda in law enforcement and how important propaganda is and how it's all based on money. Now, one of the theories of political organization that I learned in Chicago, working with some of the people there, was that a good tactic by the government is to identify a group or organize a group, tell them to choose a leader, have the leader negotiate with the manipulator, and come up with a treaty. We learned this from dealing with the Indians. We would go into Indian territory. They didn't have a concept of private property, and they were a loosely organized group or clan, and they said, pick a leader. Well, they did have their chiefs. So the chief became the leader, and the government would negotiate with the leader and tell them we're going to do this, that, and the other, and get them to concede and agree, and then put their X on little documents, not knowing what that meant, and then stealing their land. And in that manner, we ethnically cleansed the United States of its indigenous population. So back to the McKevitt days, they had an organized crime structure in Colorado that they were identifying and that they would go after. And it actually wrecked a lot of careers. It wrecked a few teachers that I know of that were identified as being mafiosa, and a couple social workers, even a few police officers and detectives. But the police department got its money, the DA's office got its money, and the state got its money to fight organized crime, even though they had manufactured it to begin with. A study of the organized crime structure in Denver was mainly about various groups or people that came in to the area during the gold rush and other eras, and they set up confidence games, various swindles, mind salting and things like this. The gangster type thing, the image from Chicago, and that didn't really exist in Colorado. There was maybe one or two gangland slayings, or alleged gangland slayings, during the 30s during Prohibition, but that was about it. And even the Prohibition era has a lot of implications of ethnic or cultural conflict rather than crime. And that's one of the problems with the study of criminology, is you don't really know whether it's a matter of ethnic cleansing or prejudice or whatever. What I do know is it's a very complicated subject that many criminologists argue about and politicians argue about. But it does generate fear, and the government likes to sell fear because they can use it to get money. So the government sells fear like Procter & Gamble sells soap. And the more fear they can peddle, the more money they can extort out of the citizenry. It's like the mafia protection racket. They go around and scare people and convince them that there's an outside enemy, and then they shake them down for money. I don't see much difference between the way the government operates and the way various mafia families operate in that arena. Fear begets money. For an example, I had this one client, and he was allegedly connected with organized crime. He was ranking number 3 in their little organizational chart. And I'm talking to him one day, and I said, "Why do you drive a Cadillac around all the time?" And he says, "I never threaten anybody. I let them use their imaginations. And generally people, if you approach them right, will think worse things than I could ever dream up." And he said, "Besides which, have you ever tried to smash any fingers in a Volkswagen door? It just doesn't work. But people see a Cadillac and they can imagine their fingers getting smashed in the door, and it has a little different effect on them. So it's all a matter of image and effect and the way you present yourself." I don't know what I would do if I seriously had to do something that would have me getting into a fight, because I'd probably get whipped. So the trick is you do psychological warfare on your opponent, and that's how you win them, because their imaginations are their worst enemies. Well, this made sense. The other thing that I noticed dealing with these people is there was a certain ritual, and there was a certain image that they had to portray. And mainly it was out of Damon Runyon. The movie Guys and Dolls is a good example of that. There's a certain aura, a certain, what would you say, presentation, a certain image that they had to portray. And that image was consistent with what the movies did. So the movie image. So it's hard for me to determine whether the movies mocked some of the behaviors that they saw, or whether they mocked the behaviors just shown in the movies. I remember one time I had a conversation with Jimmy Breslin when he was in Denver. And his experiences described in his book, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, were very similar to mine. So we're hanging out in this bar and I'm talking. I said, tell me, Mr. Breslin, did you steal your material from my clients here in Denver? He said, no, Dennis. He said, they're all about the same. They all operate the same. They have the same classic image, the same image that they're trying to project, and the same behavior patterns. And one of the funniest things in Breslin's book was these people that were trying to collect a debt on their extortion scheme from a bartender or something like that. And the guy ran away, and he ran down an alley, and they were chasing him. And all of a sudden they stopped because there was a water puddle in front of them, and they didn't want to get their alligator shoes wet. Well, that's part of the role, the costume, the perceived behavior, the image that they want to project. A similar experience happened to me. I was on a real muddy, snowy day. I had a court appearance in Jefferson County for one of these guys. And I slid getting out of my car and was covered with water, mud, etc. And I go into court to appear for this guy, and he says, what the hell are you doing coming to court like this? And he says, you look like hell. I can't have you representing me like this. So he says, you go and get a continuance. So I get and ask for continuance. That's granted. And he takes me downtown and buys me a suit, a fairly nice suit. He says, next time you come to court, you wear that and don't wear anything less. Occasionally they would give me a flashy diamond ring to wear in court. And it was an image consistent with their image and what they wanted to portray. And the image worked. I remember one time I was picking a jury and I was wondering about what their opinions were of Italian Americans and opinions of this and opinions of that. And do you think everybody that's Italian American belongs to the mafia? Have you ever heard of the mafia, etc.? And I end up by saying, is there anyone here afraid to serve on the jury? Well, the judge about went into orbit, but the point was proven, and it did have a good effect on the outcome of the trial. Anyway, we'll pick up this at a later date. Thank you for listening, and I hope you keep the cards and letters coming and your comments on YouTube. At my age and physical condition, I can use any kind of comments, good, bad, or indifferent. So thank you very much. Hopefully, we'll see you again.